Welcome to the memory chapter. I hope you have your thinking caps on. So take a look through the slides, listen to the little speaker that is shown on each slide, and it gives you a little bit more information from me and some of the things that we would have talked about in class. Take a look at the cartoon clip here. You can see that the kid is receiving a list of things that he needs to do for his mom or get from the store. But as you can see, he is paying no attention to her. And as soon as he leaves and gets distracted by the girl, he gets in an accident and completely forgets the list. The problem is that he didn't do anything to help him remember the information. So a few things that he could have done is to write it down, make eye contact, or repeat the list back to himself. Your short-term memory only lasts for 12 to 30 seconds, and so he didn't do anything to extend this list past that 30 seconds. So as soon as he gets distracted, the information goes right out of his mind and he isn't able to retrieve it when he needs it later on. Flashbulb memories are things that stand out to us, usually have a high emotional impact. So if you ask your parents, because you're probably too young to remember this, but if you ask your parents exactly where they were when 9/11 happened, they can probably tell you exactly where they were, what they were doing, and who they were with. These types of memories have a high emotional impact to us, and so that makes it stand out or engraves it into our brain a little bit deeper. When we encode, that's how we take information in. So we encode the information in through our five senses. The more of our five senses that we can use, the better off we're going to store and be able to retrieve that information at a later date. I included a clip here for you to watch from Scientific America on enhancing memory. And so take a look at the clip and you'll see what they do in the research to help the memory stick a little bit better. Emotional memories are tied to our amygdala. In the center of our brain sits the hippocampus. The hippocampus is like a U-shaped, and inside is the amygdala left and the amygdala right. So we have two amygdalas, one on each side. So that's where our emotional memories are tied to. Memories are stored all throughout the brain. There's not one specific location where they're stored at. You can see with explicit and implicit memory, there's some overlap in parts of the brain. And then there's some that's just specific to that type of memory. So explicit would be your limbic system, implicit is your cerebellum, and then both explicit and implicit is your temporal lobes, which is on either side of your head, just above your ears. And then the hippocampus as well deals with both explicit and implicit memory. Explicit tends to be more of just factual, general information that's stored in our brains, versus implicit memory has to do more with procedural, so doing things step by step, such as riding a bike, following a recipe. So that would be something that you would be doing with implicit memory. So as I said, when you encode, you want to get that information in with your five senses. The more likely you are to relate to the information, the easier it's going to stick. So when we encode the information and we use our five senses, think about when you're studying. How can you use all five senses when you study? Your sense of touch comes from writing things down, taking notes, following along, pointing with your finger, that type of thing. Your sense of sight, obviously you're reading the information, and then your hearing, as well as your sense of smell and sense of taste, all can kind of work hand in hand with each other. With those three types of senses, something like chewing gum, sucking on a mint, that can satisfy both the hearing, because you hear the noise when you're chewing or sucking on something, as well as the smell of whatever flavor it is, and then the taste of it. So you want to try, when you study, you want to try and replicate. So when you study, do the same thing when you can take the test in class. So if you're going to chew gum, chew the same type of gum when you study and chew the same type of gum when you take the test, and that should help to get those memories come back. So short-term memory, like I said, is 12 to 30 seconds. Repetition is really what we need. And it's a little bit frustrating because the schools have gotten so far away from that. And of course, there's more to learn than just repeating information and memorizing information, but we need to be able to have the basics down before we can kind of dive deeper into things. Long-term memory, there's not a specific amount. They're not stored in one place in the brain, but our brains are so expansive, we can hold lots of memories. So it's kind of an ongoing process when we store information. However, when you get a good night's sleep, that helps the memory process a little bit better and helps your brain to sort out and store things in different areas. Retrieval is how we get the information back. So that's recognition and recall. So we do that when we take a test, like your essays would be relearning the information another time. Recognition would be if you're identifying a multiple choice question, and then recall would also be like a fill in the blank type of test. So we use working memory in 3 different ways: socially, academically, and professionally. Socially, when you meet somebody for the first time. So my son's name is Zach. So, if I go up and I'm meeting Zach for the first time, I'd be like, "Hi, Zach, my name is Catherine. It's nice to meet you, Zach." You want to hear the name and repeat the name. So when Zach comes up, he should be like, "Hi, my name is Zach." So then I say, "Hi, my name is Catherine. It's nice to meet you, Zach." And so I've said it, I've heard it, and I've said it, and that helps to get the information to stick because now you're putting a face with a name and you're using it in different ways. Academically, like I said, when you were taking notes or reading a textbook or something like that, that's how we're going to use our working memory. It helps us to comprehend and to stay focused on the material that we're reading. Professionally, it helps us to stay focused in meetings, helps us to know how to respond, helps our brain to sort and process the information. Our ability to concentrate has a lot to do with our working memory in professional settings. So this whole process is known as the Atkinson-Shiffrin theory. So we take the information in through our senses, we rehearse, we store it, and then we're able to retrieve it at a later date. Sensory memory, when we take things in through our senses, it only lasts a few seconds. So that sensory sensory memory has to transfer to our short-term memory, which then has to transfer to our long-term memory. So sensory memory is just a fraction of a second or a few seconds at most. And then short-term 12 to 30, and then long-term is obviously much longer than that, anything that sticks past short-term. So if our short-term memory only lasts for 12 to 30 seconds, we need to chunk information when we have too much of it to retain because our brains can only hold so much at a time. So George Miller came up with this idea of chunking and breaking things into smaller bits of information so that we can retain it. So things that fit into this theory, this should be 5 to 9 pieces. So it's really 7 plus or minus 2 pieces of information. So like your social security number would be one. Passwords usually fit into this information. Telephone numbers fit into this. Sorry. Okay, sorry about that. The dogs are a little distracting. Hopefully they'll quiet down here. So that just gives you an idea. So these are information that we chunk into smaller parts so that we can retain it and hold on to it for longer. Repressed memories are things that are usually too traumatic for us to deal with at the time, and so our brain represses them as a coping mechanism so that we don't have to face it at the time. Repressed memories are challenging sometimes because they come back in bits and pieces. Sometimes they don't come back at all, and sometimes it's years or decades later before they do. So our memory is not not as reliable as we would think it would be. Flashbulb memories we kind of touched on a little bit already, but tip of the tongue phenomenon is like, you know it, it's right there and you just can't spit it out. That happened once when I was teaching this chapter. I could not for the life of me remember George Miller's chunking theory. Talk about him all the time every semester, but could not remember his name for anything. It's the stress hormones, and so you have to just kind of let it go and walk away from it, don't think about it, and then it usually comes back later on after you don't need the information, like when you're taking a shower or getting ready for bed, and then it's like, oh, I knew that. I knew it all along, and it just pops into your head because you've kind of relaxed from it now. Eyewitness testimony we know is not reliable. There is a YouTube, or I'm sorry, no, a TED Talk that I want you to take a look at, and I will add the link here to the notes section in the bottom of the PowerPoint, or maybe I'll put it on the slide here for you. But look for the TED Talk. It's Elizabeth Loftus. She talks a lot about false memories, and this whole idea of eyewitness testimony goes along with that. A little bit more about encoding here. So these are just fancy terminologies for your sense of sight, your sense of hearing, your sense of touch. So acoustic, echoic relates to your sense of hearing, visual, iconic relates to your sense of sight, tactile relates to your sense of touch. Semantic has a couple different meanings here. Semantic in terms of, can be in terms of language and how we go through the process of learning language. And then in regards to memory, it also is just like general information or facts that we know. So that'll come up again in another slide or two. Mnemonic devices, also known as acronyms, are just study aids or memory aids to help us remember longer pieces of information. So a lot of this has been chunked, falls into George Miller's theory. So these are things that hopefully you all remember. Maybe with slight variations here and there. So I before E except after C is just kind of a fun saying that we learned when we were learning how to spell, although it doesn't apply to every single word out there. Never eat soggy Wheaties. You probably know it as never eat soggy waffles, but I grew up when Wheaties were popular. So this is your directions, north, east, south, and west. Every good boy does fine and face relate to music. So these are both your treble clefs. So every good boy does fine is the lines of the treble clef staff. So in music class, when you were learning how to read music, E is the bottom line, G is the next line up, B is the next line up, D is the next line up, and F is the top line. And face is your spaces in between. So it would go E, and then the space would be F, and then G, and the space would be A, and so forth. PEMDAS, it's probably the one you're most familiar with here. You might have also learned it as please excuse my dear Aunt Sally. So this is in regards to math and your order of operations. So parentheses, exponents, multiplication, division, addition, subtraction. So again, these are just memory aids or tricks to help us retain information and help us kind of jog our memory when we're thinking back to it. My very earnest mother just served us 9 pickles is your planets. Mercury, Venus, Earth, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto. So this starts from the sun and works its way to the farthest planet, which Pluto's still a planet. He is a little planet, but he's still a planet. Homes is something that I'm kind of surprised more students aren't familiar with around here. This is your 5 Great Lakes, Huron, Ontario, Michigan, Erie, and Superior. So we reduce that down to homes just to try and remember what each one stands for. Other things like Roy G. Biv, you might have heard of that before. That is your colors of the rainbow. MAD, M-A-D-D, is Mothers Against Drunk Driving. So you can create these for anything. It just depends on, what you need it for. If you ever take like an anatomy class, you'll learn a lot of them for different body parts and bones and muscles and things like that. So is attention selective or selective attention? Is it intentional or unintentional? Our brains only have the ability to focus on one thing at a time. So if you're talking to somebody and it seems like they're ignoring you, they may very well be ignoring you, but it could be that their brain is focused on something else and not even realizing that you're talking to them. A divided attention, multitasking, it's really just a facade because we bounce between things very quickly, but we don't have the ability to multitask. So our brains bounce from one thing to the next, to the next, to the next, or back and forth between 2 things. So we're really not multitasking the way we think we are. We're just dividing our attention between multiple things at the same time, which unfortunately we don't focus on as well when we do that. So implicit and explicit memory broken down here. You can see implicit is into 2 parts, priming, which is how we try and get that information to come back to us. So through the use of acronyms and like remembering things step by step, and then the procedural or just facts and how to complete something. Like when you make your favorite dish at home, you don't have to read the recipe every time. You just remember how you make it because you've done it so many times. Just like somebody that hasn't driven a car in years, they can get in the car and drive again. Well, they maybe should practice a little bit, but they're not going to forget the steps as to how to drive, or what the rules of the road are. They might need a little practice, a little refresher, but they're not going to forget how. Explicit, you can see, is broken down into 3 parts: semantic, which, like I said, is just general information that's stored in your brain, kind of those random, useless facts that you don't really need, that you somehow know. Declarative information is the facts, so knowing the 50 states or the capitals of the 50 states. Some of you are probably like, I don't even know one of them. Hopefully, at least you know Illinois here, right? Since that's where we live. But who's the first president of the United States? George Washington. Who's the 16th president of the United States? Abraham Lincoln. So just facts of information that you know. Episodic memories are kind of like flashbulb memories. So episodic memories are just episodes of your life. So you probably don't remember every Christmas that you had growing up, which is kind of unfortunate because your parents spent a lot of effort and hard work into Christmas. But there's probably some that stand out when you got that really cool toy that you wanted for a long time. So other things that are episodic, your high school graduation, maybe going to prom, your wedding, the birth of your child. Those are all episodes of our life that we remember. So this is Ebbinghaus's forgetting curve. So this is where the repetition comes into play again. If we don't rehearse information, we don't remember it. The reason you still know the ABCs, even though you haven't probably said the ABCs in years, unless you have small children or work in a daycare, is because you said them every single day, all through kindergarten and maybe even some of first grade and preschool. And so it's just ingrained in our brains. We will never forget the ABCs because that repetition happens so many times. So we need to rehearse that information. So when you study for exams, it's the repetition that helps it stick. So, when you're sitting in class and you leave class and you go to work or you go home and you do whatever, that same day, if you look at this graph on here, you've already lost maybe 30% of the information that you learned in class. You have to do something with the information. So that's why they say when you take notes in class, you have to go home and rewrite those notes, because when you're sitting, listening, and the context of it is all around you, it makes sense. But, think how many of you go home and read your notes a few days later and you're like, well, what does this mean? This doesn't make any sense. I don't understand. Like, why did I write this down? It's because you've lost the context. You've lost the meaning of it. And so, when you have an exam to take 2 weeks later, you can see on our graph here, we remember only maybe 20 to 30% of that information. And so that repetition, you've got to read through the information more often. So even studying 15, 20 minutes, a day is better than if you try and not study for 2 weeks and then study for 2 hours the night before the exam. Your brain cannot cram that much information into it in such a short amount of time and be expected to remember it and process it. So there's another clip here for you to watch from Scientific America that deals with stress hormones and memory. Actually, this is a different clip. Let me think, because I gave you the stress hormone one earlier where the lady put the ice in her arm in an ice bucket, right? That was the other video. So this one that I put here is from the case study, the memory loss. So have you seen the movie 50 First Dates? Drew Barrymore and Adam Sandler. So in that movie, Drew Barrymore loses her memory every day. So she can remember things during the day. When she goes to bed at night, her brain resets and she has no memory. So this has been going on since she was in a car accident and damaged that part of the brain that builds new memories, which is around your hippocampus amygdala area. So in this video clip you're going to watch, EP, he had something similar happen. So he had an infection that hit the hippocampus area of the brain and no longer has the ability to build new memories. And so these researchers have been to his house 200 times, and he still doesn't know who they are, doesn't know their names, doesn't know anything. And so, in the 51st dates, if you've seen that, there's like that, 10-second Tom, I think his name is in the video, where he doesn't remember anything for longer than 10 seconds. So EP is not quite as bad, but he about 10, 15 minutes and he forgot. That's about the extent of his memory is 10 or 15 minutes. So he can remember things to anything previous to the infection that he got. He still has his memories intact. He just can't build any new memories because of the hippocampus area of the brain that was hit with the infection. So this is the last part of the Atkinson-Shiffrin theory that I mentioned earlier with the recognition, recall, and learn. And so when you retrieve the information, fill in the blank, you identify it, it's multiple choice, and really the best way to do it, and it's unfortunate that more schools don't do essay tests, but you're relearning the information when you have to write it out. And so that's really the best way to gauge an understanding is if a student can explain it or anybody can explain something back, then you really know that they've mastered the information. Unfortunately, though, most of your school districts and colleges as well still rely on the multiple choice exams. There's different types of Alzheimer's or dementia. One of them is like Lewy bodies dementia, it's called, or Lewy bodies Alzheimer's. And so they're little Lewy body buildups of the brain, like plaque that builds up in the brain that destroys the brain. We haven't made a whole lot of progress in regards to Alzheimer's. Early onset happens prior to the age of 60, and then most cases are after the age of 60 or 65. People on average live about 5 to 10 years, maybe 15 at most, once the symptoms have started showing. So it is a progressive disease that will eventually end one's life. There's a story here that I've shared with you from pbs.org. There's a really good book, well, a movie too, but I like to read the books first, called Still Alice. And so in the video, she has early onset Alzheimer's. She's 50 when she's diagnosed. She's a college professor. But the story is told it's a fiction book, but there's a lot of research that went into writing it to make sure that it was written accurately. And it's written from the perspective of the person suffering from Alzheimer's. So much we talk about it. We talk about the person or about the family, but not really listening to what it's like to hear from that person that suffers from it. So it's a really good book. And then they turned it into a movie, of course, a few years later. But Still Alice is what that one's called. So primacy and recency effect. This, if you can understand which effect suits you better, then that's the way you want to study. For example, primacy, it means that you're able to remember the first part of a list. Recency is the last part of something. So oftentimes when students study, they study what they know because it feels good to get the answers right, but you want to study based on how you remember things. So, a few weeks ago, now we did the learning theories chapter with Pavlov and Skinner and classical conditioning, operant conditioning. If you remember a lot of that still, you're probably the primacy effect. But, as you're reading through this PowerPoint and listening to it, if this is going to stick with you better than what we talked about a few weeks ago, then you're the recency effect. So figure out which effect you are and then study the opposite to that. If you're not going to remember the first part of something, then that's where you need to focus your efforts on. Versus if you're going to remember the last part of something, then you know where to focus your efforts on. So you have to kind of figure out what works for you.